Emphasizing here again that audio lectures contain many images, most of which are derived from the text, your book of record for the course, that do not appear on your lecture guide. When you are studying for tests or quizzes, use the lecture guides, the audio lecture guides, and the text. The lecture guides should be your main source of reference, matching up those images with the ones that are presented in slides on the audio lectures and in your text. I generally include additional material, once again, to provide a contextual idea of this chapter of history and of art movements occurring within those time frames. So while outside of Frida Kahlo, for instance, in this lecture, we don't go much into other notable artists of Latin America or Mexico at that time. I'm including their work should you choose to view it, think about it, study it for a moment, so you understand how that artist's choices of themes, of subjects, of colors, of composition are factoring into the larger movements we're studying, thereby giving you more tools, better tools with which to develop a visual vocabulary. So when you look at things like Piet Mondrian's Der Stiegel painting that is turned into a shoe, or when you look at a bathing suit based on Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, you recognize things. And in a more sophisticated way, you also recognize artwork compositions, not just items that end up being commodified. For any of you who are Googling Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, you may have come across this image, which is what? A model in a bathing suit patterned directly on Garden of Earthly Delights. The slide above, Piet Mondrian's from the Der Stil or Die Stijl movement in Holland, is on the very first week's slide when I started to talk about appropriation. So here, I'm just giving you another example. Many others can be found if you keep your eyes open and start to develop that idea of a visual vocabulary, a visual lexicon, your own visual language. You will continue to see images, as we do here, of Garden of Earthly Delights on a bathing suit. Some surrealists had an uncannily familiar way of introducing their work and making it highly successful with their viewers. And that was to link the strangeness of dreams, our unconscious, with the simultaneous familiarity of figurative representational shapes, as opposed to the abstract. Dali was one of these surrealists and perhaps the best known. Also, I would say undeniably the most flamboyant and fantastical. Very good at playing up the theatrical elements of his self-created personality. Dali is the most famous figure, along with Walt Disney, behind Disney's famous movie Fantasia. So he figured into Hollywood as well. So what he did was use the illusion of classic Renaissance perspective, along with these intense colors and very polished, highly finished surfaces, as a way of, we can say, luring in the viewer into something that may seem familiar, but then we realize contains all the quote unquote surrealism or strangeness, sometimes frightening strangeness, of dreams. Through this, artists like Dali are representing whether intentionally or not, the sorts of desires and hidden fears contained in the unconscious in ways that Lucian Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, had introduced us to. In Dali's The Persistence of Memory here, we see in this artist who really above any other symbolizes surrealism in our public imagination, creating a work that is classic in terms of its fulfilling surrealism's language and goals of art that is mad, irrational, and often erotic. Dali's self created life, his appearance, his persona, his genius for publicity coincided in a sense with the way that surrealism was represented, at least through his own work. To some of the surrealists who saw themselves as more purely artists and less in the celebrity realm, Dali was too contrived as well as his work, and they questioned his integrity along with the value of his work. But Dali was, again, a highly accomplished artist, and the technical facility, the power of his imagination, or even his own intense conviction, albeit side by side with his desire for and love of the public realm, are undeniable. Much of Dali's iconography or his vocabulary refers to, as in his own words, real or perhaps imagined episodes, but episodes that stemmed from his childhood and adolescence. He developed on his own a very precise miniaturist technique and is notable for this luminous, sometimes discordant in terms of their combination, colors. He had his own version of the trompe-l'oeil, the trick of the eye technique, that made the dream world more tangible. He himself referred to his paintings as hand-painted dream photographs. And he frequently used very familiar objects, not at all in the same way as Marcel Duchamp did, but in Dali's usage as a point of departure for surrealistic flights of fantasy. And he imparted to them a sort of fetishistic, a strange significance. So, from the very commonplace, and those objects included watches, telephones, insects, pianos, Dali dissolved and transformed them into these sort of nightmarish, unsettling objects. His art then was more surrealist in terms of, well, both an art form that defined itself in terms of formal qualities and not content, partially because the content was so much of an otherworldly realm when we're talking about surrealism. The surreal is the opposite of the real. In The Persistence of Memory, we see a denial, in a way, of every 20th century experiment in abstract organization. Looking at it closely, we can think about 15th century Flemish art and some of the greens and yellows found there. We can even think about some of the color palette of Garden of Earthly Delights. What else do we see here? Recognizable objects, watches, in an unusual context, on an unexpected scale. The main watch, one is drooped over a branch, but there's another that's a sort of soft pocket watch, devoid of any kind of structure. If they were bodies, they'd be devoid, emptied of bones. Dali described these forms as nothing more than the soft, extravagant, solitary, paranoiac, critical camembert cheese of space and time. Quite an over the top statement. According to him, he painted the work one night after dinner and he was looking at this leftover camembert, which is a soft French cheese that was melting on the table. Then he looked over at this landscape he was painting in his studio, and the images of soft watches came to him as a way of representing the idea of softness. So this idea in which matter is transformed into another state, what we could call a pictorial metamorphosis, is a very fundamental aspect of surrealism. We can also, in some sort of a basic way, see the idea of what? Of how time is melted, or how time becomes soft when we're not paying attention to it. The beautiful thing about some, at least I think many of Dali's surrealistic works, is that they invite us to introduce our own interpretations and meanings to them. I'm only including this daguerreotype here, along with Henry Fox Talbot's calotype, the two main forms of photography as it was invented in the mid 19th century, as a lament to the fact that, oh no, she's saying, as the fact that we can't include the advent of photography, the way that it changed the modern world at this time, because there just is not enough time, or I would imagine space for more images in your heads. Just quickly, the daguerreotype is this beautiful jewel-like positive to negative image that you must hold in your hand, often in velvet lined jewel-rimmed cases. And there's an intimate relationship that one forms with the daguerreotype through the handling of it. If we were having a history of photography class, I would bring in a collection of them to pass around, so you could see this marvelous way that the image shifts from a negative to a positive as you hold it. The daguerreotype is a one-off. When you make a daguerreotype, that's it, not in any way reproducible. The calotype, on the other hand, has the capacity of a negative, thereby being reproducible. That's it for photography until we look at the work of Dorothea Lange in Migrant Mothers, and along with Migrant Mother, we will look in, I think, in lecture guide number 11. There will be maybe just one photograph, and that's all we have room for. There are many artists who the Dada movement can claim as its own: outrageous, renegade, and accomplished. We are focusing on a pioneer of Dada, in a sense the founder, although he would probably eschew or deny that, Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, further down in our lecture guide. As a precursor to that and an overview of the Dada movement, Dada is an art movement that questioned every assumption about what art should be and how it should be made. Dada is a more roguish, let's say more puerile, more adolescent in a sense, precursor to the Surrealism movement. Dada paved the way for punk, is one way of thinking about it. It expressed outrage at the end of the war. It had a complete, again, knows something, disregard for the materialist and nationalist, how grown-ups have messed up the world, views that promoted the war. And when I say war here, I am referencing World War I, not World War II. Duchamp is famous for many things in addition to his fountain. He was a consummate painter who early on put that aside, saying he wasn't interested in, well, more or less a medium that was such an established one. He also removed himself from the Cubism label, although some of what he did, Nude Descending the Staircase, is classically representative of Cubism. What Duchamp is best known for is the idea of ready-mades. It also is a precursor to Warhol's commodification of objects into art. Duchamp began presenting objects that he selected, mass produced, commercially available. Sounds like Warhol to me. Often very everyday, utilitarian objects. He began presenting objects as art. We'll see what he does in the case of Fountain to quote unquote make it art. These objects are called ready-mades again. And what this did, it was a fundamental shift in the way art was made, thought about, presented. It disrupted centuries of thinking about the artist's role as a skilled creator of an original handmade artwork. Duchamp instead argued that an ordinary object could be elevated to the dignity of a work of art by the mere choice of an artist. Although even dignity was something that Duchamp was not especially interested in. Dadaists, Duchampians embraced the absurd. There was this, as I think of it, kind of an adolescent wrecking ball glee in nose-summing authority and punkishly dismantling it, vandalizing the art world's aristocratic hierarchy. So there was a whole idea of the theater of the absurd. 1912, in Zurich, there was a play, Ubu Roy, that was fundamental to the way this artistic movement that flourished during World War I and into even World War II deconstructed structures of power, language, art forms themselves in a way that dramatically turned away from realism and society. So Dada again was in a sense the first chapter of the surrealist art movement. In Kandinsky, we find a painter who, in addition to having this intense spiritual preoccupation, is a bit of a symbolist. Symbolism was a movement that encouraged artists to free themselves of concrete visual realities and instead to use bold colors, often primary colors, and simplified form as expressive tools. If we look at Der Blaureiter, we can see a time in a movement when colors actually expressed certain emotions, certain feelings. So this was a real great gateway, a time of the door opening to modernism. And a few slides down, we will see Brancusi doing the same thing in sculpture that Kandinsky does in painting. Kandinsky's genius, really, was in his taking painting to, we can even say, a higher, a more intense, more saturated level of the idea of Impressionism into the abstract modern art to a much higher degree, where the evocative relationship between color and form and feeling create a more charged and aesthetic experience even than Impressionism did, that not only conveyed those intense emotions on the artist's part, but that deeply engaged the emotions of the viewer, of his audience. Kandinsky was a fervent, almost a religious believer in the idea that abstraction offered the best possibility for a transcendental, a profound expression. In this sense, we see his spiritual aspect as looking at it as abstraction, as a religion, perhaps. Copying from nature, in his view, being solely figurative, would only disrupt would interfere with this process. Painting was deeply spiritual for Kandinsky, and he also linked it very closely with music, which he saw as the most transcendent form of non-objective art. The way musicians could evoke images purely through sounds in a listener's mind. So Kandinsky's placing of music on the highest platform of art was fundamental to the way he looked at his painting. And through painting, he strove to produce similar spiritually rich emotional experiences that could unite the idea of sound with emotion. Bluntly put, if we're trying to take the unwieldy idea of analytic cubism down to a formula, we can say that it is one in which the object is analyzed, broken down into pieces. We can even say literal shards, sharp edge pieces. It's dissected. In this way, we're being asked to read space and volume in a completely different, again, I would argue, disruptive ways. Shapes look almost mechanized. They're overlapping, they're tilting, they're shifting like a scene from different positions. Highly conceptual, as is actually a truer sense of reality in terms of how the modern world is perceived at this point in time in the early and mid 20th century. When we look at Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon, we are looking at something that has been termed a new sort of beauty. Beautiful or not, it was something that was completely discordant and, of course, not accepted, as you could imagine, in the art canon of that time. Picasso is commonly credited with originating the idea of cubism, but we can see in these slides here that Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase certainly qualifies as a classic, really perfect example of cubism. Picasso also shares that originator's title with his colleague Georges Braque, with whom he worked so closely. They worked apart, but they worked at the same time, and they were constantly looking at each other's work. It's difficult, without close analysis, sometimes to tell a Braque and a Picasso cubist painting or construction apart. There are two branches of cubism. One is analytic, the second is synthetic. We don't have time, of course, to look at these, the best examples, of which there are many, in great detail or in great number. We don't have time to go into the early ideas of cubism in Cezanne. Suffice it to say that in imagining a new pictorial, creating a new complex, really, pictorial vocabulary, Picasso and Braque move through several different stages. If we're looking at, we have two abstraction Picassos on our lecture guide. If we are looking at the first, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, we are looking at the first example, analytic cubism. In analytic cubism, the idea of how a viewer can read, can understand space and volume is completely disrupted in terms of dismantling the Renaissance linear perspective, no spatial recession, a lot of flatness. The way we look at different techniques rendering time and space introduces a whole different chapter of painting in the modernist time, in which much of the world, its social, political structures is dismantled too. We're talking about World War I, World War II, major socioeconomic and geographical and country borderline shifts. In contrast to analytic cubism, when we get to synthetic cubism, the second phase, the second stage of cubism, in a nutshell, from the deconstruction of the image, often into these sharp-edged, shard-like cubist-like shapes, we begin to build the image up again. So the image is deconstructed in analytic and it's reconstructed in synthetic cubism. What do we use? What are the actual materials used in this reconstruction? Collage. Braque and Picasso are both working with collage, often newspaper at this point. They're adding three-dimensional elements as well, pieces of rope, sometimes around the image, creating a frame. It's also important to note when we look at the newspaper clippings themselves, and understanding that collage as a medium is a new type of realism that is capable of expressing different ideas than the materials, the actual newspaper print and storyline that this painting incorporates. So different layers, shifting, contrasting, but built up instead of decomposed, of a material reality. It's also important to note that these newspapers would have contained very specific kinds of clippings, stories within the clipping, the newspaper, the isolated piece of newspaper being a clipping, it's called a clipping. There would be specific political, for instance, sentiments expressed in that piece of paper. And it's arguably much the case that Picasso and Braque were using very specific clippings, and perhaps, or undoubtedly, the truth that in some of these, in order to, let's say, more successfully advance the idea of attacking, in a sense, the idea of traditional painting, he was also using newspaper clips that amounted to an attack on the state of the world. If we're looking at the just pre-World War I, such as the 1912, 1913 works especially, as the political situation is escalating into World War I. There are three clippings featured in Glass and Bottle of Suze that refer to incidents during the First Balkan War, specifically in which Turkey was defending the Ottoman Empire. Two of the dispatches are heightening the horrors of war occurring in the wintertime, that war particularly, the wounded and the dying. There are other stories, other clippings that refer to more pedestrian, rather frivolous aspects of Parisian society at this time. So again, there's this fracturing, in a sense, of the aspects of life that before this time, when the world is being shaken up in the modern age by art, by technology, by socio-political economic conditions, juxtaposing some sort of silly social high life clippings with some very dire war ones, are one way of showing us that we have a sort of not just hallucinogenic but surreal juxtaposition at this point of time, in the war, between this idea of the war and these ideas of silliness. What else do we see here? Pieces of wallpaper are featured in the backdrop. What else do we see that's significant? Suze. What is Suze? This is not the name of a woman. It's a liqueur, a rather bitter liqueur that was popular in French cafes at the time. So there's this idea of the everyday being incorporated into this, as well as this juxtaposition of sort of frivolous, fictitious social life and dire wartime stories. Picasso was once asked by his companion, and he had many beautiful muses who were the subjects of his painting, as well as his mistresses, some of them his wives, um, about the meaning of this category called these papier collés, that his paintings that incorporated images that were collages. And she wondered, Francoise Gillot, um, who is featured in actually, she's one of the two most featured of Picasso's female companion subjects. If this was the fading out, sort of the last legs of Cubism. And Picasso's response to this was to say, we tried to get rid of trompe-l'oeil. What is trompe-l'oeil? We've studied this trick of the eye. To find a trompe l'esprit. He means a trick of the spirit in a way, trick of the mind. We didn't any longer want to fool the eye, he said. He said we wanted to fool the mind. The sheet of newspaper, he went on to say, was never used in order to make a newspaper. So this displaced object has entered a universe for which it was not made and where it retains its strangeness. And this strangeness is what we wanted to make people think about, because we were quite aware that our world was becoming very strange and not exactly reassuring. Not the best of translations, but you get the idea of it. And perhaps all the mysteries of this provocative work will never be known exactly. What else do we see going on in here? This light brown vertical image at the left, created through a gouache watercolor technique. A black zigzag on the other side. The cork seems like a head, rather small and bowed. There's a spiral of black charcoal around the stem of the glass, and there's a hand holding the glass. If we look at what features as the glass, as if it's offering it to us in a toast. In a sense, we're almost looking down over this composition, trying to decipher these elements that have some base in the figurative, that are not entirely abstract, and what they might mean. There are several artists during this period when the world is being rocked by modernism, whose work is difficult to specifically link to a particular school or art movement, although they may borrow aspects of Cubism or Surrealism. They don't completely fit into those movements sometimes, and Brancusi is one of those. So in a sense, he is working with art that is avant-garde. There's something primitive about it. He's not a symbolist. What he is, however, is really the founding figure of modern sculpture. By modern, I mean abstract, and one of the most original artists of the 20th century. What his groundbreaking work does is introduce abstraction and primitivism into sculpture for the first time. So the way that Kandinsky breaks a barrier or border about the same time in painting and creates the idea of abstraction while still incorporating representative elements, Brancusi does the same thing for sculpture. So Brancusi is notable for breaking a boundary into the abstract. In his case, sculpture. Kandinsky in painting does a parallel thing. So Brancusi is forging into something. At the same time, by primitive, I mean something that's purer, In addition to his breakthrough into the abstract, he's also creating this sense of something pure, almost in a religious sense. The work looks often isolated, very much unto itself. Yet, in another way, it seems to speak this kind of universal truth. Brancusi uses absolutely simplified geometric forms, and he always works his own work himself. He doesn't hire assistants to carve his pieces, be they marble or working in wood or bronze. Truth to materials, quote unquote, is his mantra. He's interested in, as is Kandinsky, creating this higher spiritual plane of something that speaks to the spiritual, the religious, and the poetic. Although Kandinsky utilizes some biblical themes like the flood, Noah's Ark, Brancusi doesn't represent specific figurative elements that relate to those kinds of religious themes. But what Kandinsky and Brancusi have in common, as opposed, in addition rather, to being groundbreaking, is this idea of an intense focus on an allegiance to the spiritual. So the idea of religiosity for them is represented through the spiritual. Brancusi works with a few very specific themes, not a wide vocabulary of them. And he never really deserts the figure, however abstract some of his works seem to be. Again, his materials are simple in that most sculptors work with one or two, maybe two or three raw materials. In Brancusi's case, mostly marble, certainly some bronze and wood. And again, he carved all his work himself, a process that he called direct carving. It would mean that the artist himself, as opposed to an assistant or a disciple being instructed, he would need to know and understand the properties of the material he was working with. The way that we can understand other sculptors we've looked at. Who might those be? If we think back to David and working a particularly difficult block of 40-year-old marble, and to which David do I refer? I will ask you to ponder that. Knowledge of the four that we've studied. So knowledge of this particular block of stone, if we're looking at Sleeping Muse 1, there is of course a Sleeping Muse 2, and there are several variations of these works, some in bronze. We are only looking at Sleeping Muse 1 for our lecture guide in marble. So knowledge of his materials, he in this case, and their properties help us to define the work's appearance and the way that the artist uses the properties of metal, the properties of bronze. This is what Brancusi referred to as truth to materials. What do we have, if we have anything spiritually revealed in Sleeping Muse? Brancusi worked for 20 years with this idea of a sleeping head shape on its side. Again, as I mentioned, different media, and he also worked with plaster in addition to bronze and marble. There's nothing but the most simplified fundamental form, simplified details, reducing ideas to fundamental forms and details here. Does it relate to the idea of creation, of birth? Very basic symbolic ideas. Life, death. Does it recall the idea of an egg in its oval, clean form? Each of these is carved out of course, a single piece of stone. If it's an egg, Can you think of something else it might remind you of? What are the advantages of a sculpture that can call to mind more than one shape? If it's meant to recall this idea of an egg as well as a head, does it call on any other themes? Does it resemble other ideas if we're talking about this concentration on birth, life, and death? Brancusi was also very obsessed with birds, and his Bird in Space, this very highly polished marble bird, there are also bronze versions of it, are outstanding pieces, all versions of them, that open the space, the volume of sculpture in terms of ideas taking flight, to be very literal. In Bird in Space, Brancusi said, here's what he was looking to resolve. He said, when you see a fish, you don't think about its scales. You think about the speed of its movement, its gleaming body seen through water. That's what I wanted to express. I was searching for the spark that animates its spirit. So when we think of his other pieces, such as Sleeping Muse, what kind of a spark of birth, of life, of death is he looking to express there and to almost commune with the viewer through? Here we are back to Duchamp. As a review, Duchamp's ready-mades are composed of found objects, often everyday objects, such as a bottle rack. He intentionally chose to be guided by what he called an anesthesia. He wanted to employ complete visual indifference, and he wanted to remove the criteria of artistic choice from the nomenclature, from the categories of good taste or bad taste, high culture or low culture. Here we definitely see strains of what Andy Warhol does, not too much later in the US. The idea of surrendering to chance is also part of the idea of Dada, randomness. So while this embrace of Duchamp's ready-mades were uncommonly irritating to the art world of Duchamp's day, the idea, the mere concept that art could qualify as being made out of virtually anything by anyone and required little or no manipulation by the artist was a way of turning assumptions on their ends, of upending them. We come from a place where, say, during the time of the Impressionists, the idea of artists having agency, making things that convey their experiences, impressions, without the rubric, the structure, the umbrella, the mandate, the commission of a patron, be it the church or a wealthy merchant like Jan van Eyck. Artists have agency. Now Duchamp throws that out the window and says, none of that is important. When we see Fountain, what do we see? We see this rectified, in a sense, right? This remade, ready-made. Duchamp takes a urinal, he turns it around 90 degrees, he calls it Fountain, and he signs it R. Mutt. Other well-known Duchamp works are the way that he reframes, in a sense, an old bicycle wheel on a commonplace, an ordinary kitchen stool, and maybe his best known, we've looked at it several times now, his famously irreverent addition of a mustache and a goatee to a reproduction of the Mona Lisa, which we then see Jeff Koons taking, minus the mustache and the goatee, to a whole new level of commodification involving you, the viewer, just 4 or 5 slides down here. Frida Kahlo, one of our best known Latina artists and one of our best known women artists of any time or from any country. Frida upended the world of portraiture by introducing this highly personal, emotional component into that tradition. So while the works are often intimate and very personal, they also become universal in terms of themes that are common to women, heartbreak, that on one hand portray a highly modern and driven female artist, as Frida was, as well as someone who embraced her traditional culture through costume and other elements. The two Fridas shows a split, a painting made after her divorce from the famous and highly accomplished Mexican painter Diego Rivera. So, in a sense, it's showing Frida's two personalities, one with a broken heart and her literal broken heart after her divorce. It's not unusual in employing an X-ray view into the image. This is not the only image of Frida's in which she shows visibly organs. Here, the heart of the traditional Frida in traditional costumes is shown torn open. There's blood accumulating on her white dress. Many of Frida's paintings are thought of as surrealistic. And while she may have been claimed by the surrealists, she never herself associated herself with that label, certainly not primarily. And what she did certainly do, however, was forge a completely new, again, highly personal and emotional and intimate, as well as all holds barred, exposed type of elements into portraiture that had not existed previously. So she's a representative figurative artist who's doing something radically different in terms of her content.